So what we tend to do with our lectures is, rather than give you a kind of who, what, when of a particular text or an author, which you can and should get from books, and you can and maybe shouldn't get from the internet, to give you a way of thinking about the text that you're studying, that you're looking at in your supervisions or your tutorials, but flipping them around, looking at them from a different perspective, focusing in on some unusual elements or passages to give you a fresh look to accompany the close focus work that you're going to be doing in your independent study. So, what I want to start by doing is to get you to cast your mind back or forward. One thing I should also say before starting is that there are going to be some slides that I'm going to be using some Latin and Greek, but this lecture is completely comprehensible for everyone who hasn't studied those languages as well. So, with that being said, I'd like to start by getting you to cast your minds backwards or forwards to three of perhaps the most well-known, famous, influential works of epic, of ancient Greek and Latin poetry in the classical tradition: Homer's Iliad, Homer's Odyssey, and Virgil's Aeneid. Now, one thing that is immediately evident from a read of any of these poems is how many female characters they have in them. They're everywhere. You have the poetic females of the muses, to whom the poems are dedicated, sung, from whom they draw their inspiration, their reasons for being. Tons of women in the narrative as characters, both mortal and divine, on all sides of all sorts of conflicts at home and abroad. I've put just some examples. I'm not going to read those out, but you can have, and we'll have tons more. But there's an immediate catch to this kind of fundamental fact. Despite the regular as clockwork involvement of women in these epic narratives, the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid claim as their themes, as their programmatic, i.e. their kind of deep identity as their core, fundamentally masculine ideals. This is clear from the opening words of all of these poems. The wrath, which in Greek is a female word, menis, but it's a wrath belonging to Achilles. The first name we get in the poem is a male name of, belonging to him, and he belongs to another man, the son of Peleus, despite the fact that Thetis as a character is far more prevalent. The mother is far more prevalent in the narrative than the father, but Achilles is termed, he's named by his belonging to his father's side. The first word of the Odyssey, very famously, is in fact andra, is man. And it's a poem about man, or the man, Odysseus himself. And the Aeneid famously combines the themes of war, of armour, and the man, Aeneas. And indeed, the ideals that drive the narratives of all these poems, things that any study of these poems would make very clear. Kleos, glory, fame, time, honour, when Achilles sings of the Clea and Drone, all of these kind of driving ambitions of the poem, which are desired by men, attainable only by men, and never notoriously open to women. Penelope is the only character in any of these epics who gets close to having Kleos, and that's only in the underworld when Agamemnon compares her renown to that of a king. So by a dead guy in a space of otherness when she's not even there via a comparison. Not quite getting Kleos. And even the muses, the so-called kind of without whom these epics wouldn't be possible at all, the relationship between the male poetic bard or rhapsode and the muses is perhaps not quite so deferential after all. These female muses are asked, but really they're told, and the verbal form is often an imperative. It's an order to tell or to sing. So they're being told what to do. So really, who's in the driving seat there? And Virgil goes one step further. He says, I sing of arms and the man. And then much later on in his opening, he tells the muse not to sing, but to remind him. He says, Muse, remind me of the causes. So there's a real kind of jostling for power there too. Now, a lot of what I've said would be recognizable in so much literature about trying to reclaim the voices of females in ancient literature, which of course is a valid and a very popular turn in classical scholarship. That's not quite what I want to do today, though, because I think it's important really to take seriously this state of play. That female characters are prevalent in our ancient epics. They're fascinating, they're interesting, they're smart, they're important, they're good to think with and they're good to be with. But epic actively resists following through with this clear interest in female characters. It resists theorizing the feminine, and it resists making these interesting women part of its heroic thematic core. Now, what, again, I want to do with this fact as something to sit with and to think with is not do a lecture about women in ancient literature. Lots of very good lectures can and have been done on that topic, but this isn't going to be one of them. It's actually going to take seriously that resistance, and like with any good resistance in literature, to use it to try and locate different ways of thinking about the female characters that we do find beneath, within, and indeed beyond that fundamental ideological masculinity. So I'm not going to try and claim that women have a place in Kleos and Timeh, but actually that by side-slanting, by taking seriously that resistance, we can find very productive spaces in between, looking at how ancient literature kind of recognises this tension between lots of female characters but a masculine centrality, and provides the space to think alternatively. And as is, of course, plot spoiled by my big PowerPoint slide at the beginning, the particular lens I'm going to look at to provide this, or to give this alternative perspective, to take this resistance seriously, is sister-to-sister relationships. Now, one other way in which I think one can take seriously this fact that epic resists theorizing the feminine, resists kind of promoting its female characters to a central place in its narrative identity, is in the microcosm of the power dynamics of the family. Now, the family in ancient epic is very much the kind of a miniature through which much wider dynamics of power can be observed, be it poet and his predecessors, or poet and his politics, or politician and his dynasty. Now, in Homer, despite the fact that we have many, many families with many different family relationships, like all good families, think about how many children Hecuba and Priam had, a ton, of both genders, the relationships that get centralized in the narrative are men. Not only the patronymic, Achilles, son of Peleus, Odysseus, son of Laertes, Telemachus wanting to shoot his father's bow, but also mothers and sons, husbands and wives, Andromache saying that Hector is her father and her queenly mother as well as her husband, but never sisters and sisters. And this is despite the fact that we know that there are lots of sisters, there are lots of females, Cassandra, Iphigenia, and so forth, in the families that are embroiled in Homeric epic. They never get time in the narrative spotlight, in the narrative sun. We just don't see sisters on the epic stage. And excuse the metaphor, because it's not a stage. And again, vis-a-vis this idea of taking this resistance seriously, not berating it because we'd like to see this particular female space, taking seriously almost the fact that the epic poet knows that this is a relationship that they're not spotlighting, is where we see these kind of exceptions around the edges. And there is precisely one sister-to-sister relationship that does come up in Homer. And I say comes up because it's in a dream. And one thing that we know about dreams in Homer is they're a way of kind of merging the being and the not being. It's a way of having a kind of counterfactual space that exists and doesn't exist at the same time, a bit like going to the underworld. This is Penelope's less famous dream, her famous dream being where she tells Odysseus, the beggar that she doesn't know is her husband, in Odyssey 19, that she had a dream where her geese were killed and she was very upset. This is a dream that never really gets spoken about, and it ought to. Much earlier in the poem is when Telemachus has just left to go in search of his father. Again, these male-to-male prioritized relationships. Penelope has been therefore left, in terms of the nucleus of her family, completely alone. Her husband has been gone for so long. Her son is now gone in search of his father, has left his mother, and she's kind of alone in a very, very, very crowded, claustrophobic room with the suitors closing in. And she goes to sleep, and she weeps in her sleep. Not crying herself to sleep, that modern adage, she mourns in her sleep. And Athena recognizes the need to somehow break this blockage in Penelope's loneliness. And she sends Athena sends Penelope, in a dream, the ghost of her sister, Ipsime. Now, this is the only time we hear about Penelope having a sister. Never again, never since. But it's a big scene. And as Penelope, in the midst of her wailing and lamenting, Ipsime comes to her and asks her why she's weeping. Penelope replies, gives a kind of potted version of her situation, long and sort of empowered and anguished. And then Ipsime says, take heart, don't be afraid. A guide goes with Telemachus. Athena pities you in your sorrow, and she sent me forth to tell you this. Now, in the English translation, that sounds kind of okay, a bit of condolence. But the language here is really telling. And that final word there that I've put in Greek, muthesasthai, now that's a really powerful word in Greek. Mutheomai doesn't just mean speak. There are tons of different words for speak. But the idea of a muthos, very complicated word from which we get various connected and disconnected things like myth, like lie. But in archaic Greek epic, it might mean something like authoritative speech, utterance, not very catchy, but in the idea of it's speaking with force, it's a speech act. And so often that is connected to heroic speech. It's what men do. And here we have female goddess, whose own gender is complicated and ambivalent, sending to female queen the ghost of her sister to give this authoritative speech act. So a couple of things to kind of draw from this. No sister-to-sister relationships in Homer, and yet the one character who never leaves Ithaca, who never has the kind of kleos, time, adventurous experiences of her husband or any Homeric hero, who kind of exists to be an archetypal wife, and yet is the only one who gets compared even, who gets close to kleos by what Agamemnon says about her in the underworld. Athena sends her a dream, and they connect through lamentation, through mourning. Penelope's mourning is the trigger for this dream being sent. Her lamentation triggers action, so I want to flag that. And as a result, they have this exchange which is clearly making some sort of claim to power through this idea of the muthos, of the empowered speech. And in the power dynamics, the potted power dynamics of a household, these factors potentially suggest a space where female to female, family intimate interaction can be empowering in a household in a dynamic that doesn't require men and actually doesn't admit men at all. Now, in the Odyssey, this is safely confined to the dreamscape. Doesn't actually happen, but it happens for us. It's in our poetic memory. But I think the dynamics set up here are very important for what happens next. Now, sisterhood, the sister-to-sister relationship that we don't see ever enacted in Homer, does start to appear in the Greek literature and the Latin literature that follows, really in the 5th century. This seems to be the turning point, where we start to see, in Greek mythological poetry specifically, so following this particular generic arc, we start to see sister-to-sister relationships. And that's not just by chance. There's a real reason for this. And again, I think taking that Penelope passage seriously to kind of think with. Now, one of the things that we know that happened in the 5th century, that again the Penelope passage perhaps brings to the foreground, is that the close relationship between what could be considered the intimate, enclosed dynamics of the oikos, the household, and the public-facing dynamics of the city, the polis, became increasingly overlapping. What constituted private and what constituted public were, if ever they were, but they were never quite so opposed. In the midst of everything in the 5th century, where entertainment itself was absolutely public-facing, and the Dionysia in the festivals, in the midst of a particularly brutal war, where things like burying one's family, became something that couldn't be extricated from public life. Now, the fact that Penelope was weeping when her sister appeared to her also offers an indication to role of the females in public life that became particularly pronounced in this dynamic of the 5th century, when burial, when public commemoration of the dead became increasingly big public business. And that's that female participation in burial rites was a key way in which we know that females were very involved, women were very involved in civic life. Women were involved in washing the body, in anointing the body, and in carrying out the laments that were a key part of their commemoration. And again, this has its origins all the way back in Homer. If we think about the last substantial speeches in the Iliad aren't heroic utterances. It's not Achilles and Priam weeping because they're both fathers and so forth. It's women. It's the laments in the funeral of Hector. And females' role in laments in the 5th century became something that we have evidence that was both paradoxically legislated in favour of. We have legislation preserved that shows that women were expected to participate in funeral rites, but also, and perhaps consequently, it provoked real anxiety. And one really famous passage, which often is taken to be the kind of epicenter of this anxiety about female involvement in public discourse through particularly their very embedded role in public funerals, is Pericles' funeral oration, which is part of the second book of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. Now, this is a passage which I'm half guilty of doing here, but it often gets extracted, and it's important to think about in a much wider context, both in terms of Thucydides' own prose, but also in terms of wider things that were going on at the time. But Pericles delivering this very famous oration, commemorating the dead at this pivotal point in the war on the Kerameikos, he has a kind of weird triple bluff in terms of what he has to say about women. He says, if I must say anything on the subject of female excellence, to those of you who are in widowhood, I'm going to say this briefly. Great will be your glory by not proving inferior to your nature, and hers is the greatest glory whose fame, whether for excellence or blame, spreads least among the males. And you have that word kleos again, that is never available to females. So it's very, very significant that Pericles is in a public space. He's giving his own authoritative speech act qua his role, but is worried about female speech in a space which is dangerously close to a place where they could also, quite legitimately, qua their very embedded participation in the rituals of lament, also have a voice. And again, I think this takes us back very importantly to this haunting exception in Homer. Because if we think about the dangerous intimacy involved in women being the last people to have physical intimacy with the body of a loved one, if they're involved in the washing and the preparing the body for the final ceremonial processions, and the fact that female lament is a kind of legitimized way of females having authoritative speech, but it doesn't quite seem so private and the grief within the household after all, because it is this alternative way of having a platform to speak, then one can start to see this idea of kind of a dangerous intimacy with female-to-female interaction. And what better relationship to play out that dangerous intimacy than sister to sister? So I don't think it is any coincidence at all that it is in the Greek mythological literature of the 5th century that we start to see in really weird, unexpected, quite deviant ways, sister-to-sister bonds being brought onto stage. And I just want to finish by looking at 3 examples of what I kind of call a deviant sister-to-sister spotlighting. Now, interestingly, and I don't have a definitive answer for this, but it's something I've been thinking about quite a lot, Sophocles seems particularly interested in spotlighting the sister. And his renowned, infamous, notorious, whatever you want to call it, play The Antigone, which, lo and behold, is centred precisely on ideas of burial rite, R-I-G-H-T, we might say, and rite, R-I-T-E. Antigone's desire to bury her brother causes her to contravene the laws of the city, enter into this explosive agon with Creon, which ultimately leads to her death. And that plot summary, which is the sort of summary that's always given, sounds again. Antigone, our female tragic hero, and her relationships with various males, her brother who she wishes to bury, her fiancé that never becomes her husband, and Creon, the rigid enforcer of the city's laws. And yet, actually the most important, linguistically significant relationship that Antigone has isn't with any of those characters, is with her sister, Ismene. Now, how do I define and demonstrate importance, not just because I say so, because I'm interested in it? Well, there are lots of different ways one could argue for that importance. Number one is that Sophocles starts with it. We know that openings of poems, openings of plays, are places where authorial playwright hands, cards are dealt, hands are laid. And Sophocles starts in a play all about this sort of unique character, Antigone, who's had got the biggest critical debate, probably of all characters. You think he'd start with a monologue, but he absolutely does not. He starts at a liminal space just outside the city, at daybreak, all of these times, again, where the kind of the being and the not being can blur. He starts with a dialogue, with Antigone talking to her sister. And again, it's not just the fact that she talks, but like Penelope in her dream, it's what she says that's super important. She starts by saying, well, I actually am not going to translate it, but you can read that first line there. And the first line of the Antigone is famously untranslatable. The Greek, which I've put in bold, there's no verb there. It's a string of nouns and adjectives. If I was going to do something literal, it'd be something like, O common same sisterly head of Ismene. It means nothing, and yet it means everything. Every single word is about her connectedness to Ismene. It's almost like the incest of the play, which is such a theme of the play, has seeped into its very language. There's a strained incest to this line. And the character that famously is all about herself asks a string of questions. And these aren't rhetorical questions. She's wanting something from her sister. And Ismene's reply is also, if not more, important. Ismene starts by saying, to me, Antigone. Now, Ismene is always read as the foil to Antigone. Everything that makes Antigone so defiant, such an icon, or such a disaster, Ismene's the opposite. She's kind of normative. She's the oikos to Antigone's polis. She's the voice of restraint. But the first word of Ismene's speech is emoi. It's for me. And I think that this is Sophocles' cue, that we need to take her own identity very, very seriously. And even that second word there, and this is where Greek really pushes on the kind of micro, that word that looks like it says men, and indeed it does say men, Greek has a way of kind of thinking about itself in a double act. It's basically sort of on the one hand, on the other hand, men and dare. But here we have men on its own, without a dare at all. So Ismene, who's always defined as just the answer to her sister's questions, is really linguistically, Sophocles is saying, take this character seriously. And lo and behold, she says, no word about our friends has come. And the word she uses for word is muthos, that authoritative speech act again. And so although Ismene goes on, and that's the third line I've bolded there, to use a form of Greek, Greek has this amazing form called the dual. So where we have to say two friends or two twins, ancient Greek can do that in one word, drawing. It has a form for two. And she has a duality in her very language, but it's a duality made out of two individuals. And this, I think, is the perfect way in which Sophocles plays out in his language the importance in Ismene and Antigone as sisters, and Ismene as a sister. And another kind of fact, perhaps, to show importance, is she lives to tell the tale. She survives the play. The sister lives on. The brother doesn't, and the sister does. Second and penultimate example is another Sophoclean play, later on in time, that's often considered to be very riffing off the Antigone. And it's where Sophocles does his own version of another family that, as a metaphor for the kind of polis collapsing in on itself, the doomed house of Atreus, where this kind of chain of killing, of wives killing husbands, of children killing mothers and fathers, this whole family that kind of drops in its scenes. Now, the most famous children of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra are, of course, Iphigenia or Orestes. But not only, when Sophocles returns to this infamous doomed house, does he focus on Electra, but he also introduces or reintroduces another child, Chrysothemis. And the jury's out about whether how much Sophocles is actually sort of creating this character, or he's kind of bringing someone who was already there to the foreground. But either way, Chrysothemis becomes a real double act to Electra in a very similar way to Ismene and Antigone, but a similar way in the sense of don't succumb to the normal readings of Chrysothemis just being a foil to Electra's attempt to be a Medea and an attempt to seize male masculine ideology. I think what's actually going on here is far more interesting because it's far more complicated. And in this brilliant passage, almost 1,000 lines into the play, this is when Electra is really intent on her mission to avenge her father by killing her mother. And the reasons that she's trying to get Chrysothemis to help her. And she says, well, as to fame, Eucleia, very related to the word kleos, we want to have fame on the lips of men. Do you not see how much you're going to add to our fame if you obey me? Citizens and strangers, when they see us, will greet us with praise, and they'll say, look on these sisters, friends. And then all these things, she says, will be said, and our fame, our kleos, will never die. And then Chrysothemis says, where have you turned your gaze, that you arm yourself? Do you not see you're a woman, not a man, and your strength is less than your enemies? Now, the obvious reading of this is so obvious. It's Chrysothemis being normative, female, telling Electra to know her place, get back into the house. But I think the language unravels these obvious interpretations again. Now, Chrysothemis is using Electra's language back against her. So like we saw with Antigone and Ismene, there's a dialogue here, even though it's a dialogue in conflict. There's a mirroring going on. Whereas Electra says, do you not see? Chrysothemis says, have you turned your gaze? And Chrysothemis, too, uses masculine language, arming yourself, the metaphor of arming herself with rashness. But she's using it to serve her own point in the argument. And the thing that I love the most, actually, is she goes one step further. When she says, do you not see? She's actually showing that what Electra wants is in its own way much more empty. It's much more artificial. Because when Electra says, do you not see? What she's asking for is, don't you see how much we're going to be spoken about by men? So all she actually doesn't really want to see at all. She wants to be seen. She wants to be spoken about. Whereas Chrysothemis is asking her not just to be looked at, but to look. So there's a way in which we can read this scene as Chrysothemis issuing a reminder that actually this masculine idea of kleos, of being heard about, of being commemorated, is actually just as vain, just as self-objectifying, just as empty and people-pleasing as any kind of much more feminine aesthetic of being the object of male desire. So Chrysothemis is not just pushing back against her sister as a woman, but is actually offering a critique on the kind of vanity, underscoring the male ideas of glory that Electra thinks that she wants. And to end, no lecture on sisters would be complete without looking at one of the most devastating sister-to-sister acts in ancient literature, that of Virgil's Aeneid. Now, those of you who are doing Latin A-level and are doing book 12 will be used to a sister, very important sister, in the figure of Juturna. But again, what I've been trying to say today is, yes, Juturna's a very important sister, but she's a sister in relation to a brother. And what Virgil gives us with Dido and Anna is, again, this sister-to-sister spotlighting. And of course, although, as I said at the beginning, Virgil, on the one hand, claims a Homeric, masculine, ideological, thematic centre, but he also is writing in the wake of tragedy, in the wake of this lament-driven sister-to-sister dangerous intimacy, and, lest we forget, in his own political world, where masculine lineage, the struggle to secure a masculine dynasty, was teetering already. So again, no coincidence, I think, that Virgil shows this interest in a kind of deviant sisterliness as an alternative way of thinking about units of power, and indeed of love. And I think that what we see here, kind of what I hope I've been intimating, there's lots of destructive dynamics in these sisters, but there's a lot of genuine feeling and emotion. And in a book where the romantic relationship that we want, or maybe we want, we never get. Dido and Aeneas, it's not a great love story. When they speak at cross purposes. Aeneas' famous taciturnity, his few words that he says, his refusal to know or to admit that he knows what he's done. All of that speech, all of that interaction, all of that devastation and lament that we want from Aeneas and we don't get until it's too late in the underworld, we get in Anna. And I think this non-romantic love that we see between these sisters is perhaps one of the greatest love stories that we find. And I think interesting to think about Juturna and Turnus, perhaps in that way too. And again, I've just put a few examples of how that plays out in the language. Again, the fact that Virgil starts the Dido book, if you want to call it that, after Aeneas has just chatted on for 2 whole books of the poem, he starts with Dido and Anna, not Dido and Aeneas, with Dido and Anna. They are the reply, as it were. And Virgil talks about Anna being Dido's unanimam, one-minded sister, I think very clearly thinking about Antigone and Ismene and their kind of incestuous closeness. I say incestuous not in a kind of deviant way here, but in the sense of they're inextricably close even through their discourse. And even that simplicity, Dido's first words in book 4 are Anna soror, Anna my sister, kind of beautiful in its simplicity. Was Aeneas her husband? She called it a marriage and it wasn't. All the kind of dangerous language games we get there. The sisterness is true, and it's there. And Anna actually gets the final substantial speech of book 4. She's the final human to speak in book 4 as well, thinking about the women in the Iliad being the final substantial speeches in the whole of Homer's poem. And this is when Aeneas never knows what Dido's done. Anna viscerally knows, and this is a scene that's haunting, devastating in its description. When Anna finds out or thinks she knows what's happened, Virgil describes her as ex animis, half, and lots of the translations don't do this justice, but basically means she's half dead. So not only is she anguished by what's happening to her sister, she seems to share in it. And this is enacted physically when she sees what's happened and she kind of physically jumps onto Dido's body as she dies. And so she seems to kind of become one with her in her death. Very powerfully acted out in later art. She also starts, again, thinking about the importance of lament as a dangerous form of female intimacy. She starts to perform almost the burial rites for Dido here as she's dying. She tells people to bring her water to bathe the wounds, and she's also physically uttering language of lament herself. And the final, I think, very provocative point is also in her language here. We see some interesting echoes in terms of what Anna feels about Dido abandoning her, what Dido said about Aeneas. When she says, she talks about aiming her fraud, her deceit. She calls Dido cruel one, exactly what Dido said to Aeneas. And she talks about kind of her fleeing away. So again, well, I'm not suggesting a kind of, when I'm trying to put pressure on the non-romantic element of this, but it shows the depth of the connection. The strength of the abandonment she feels is just as powerful and just as intense as what Dido feels for the husband that wasn't. So yeah, to conclude, I hope I've suggested just a little bit about how putting pressure on a relationship that in Homer, and also in a way in Virgil and tragedy, could go under-interrogated. Often in these kind of this surge in what's often annoyingly called feminist retellings of ancient Greek myth. Lots of emphasis is put on sisters. And both of these books have, the Electra by Jennifer Saint has Clytemnestra and Helen as sisters, talking about wouldn't it be great if they married brothers. And again, Clytemnestra and Helen are sisters. We just don't see it played out in central narratives in our surviving texts. But the Children of Jocasta, one of the kind of reviews says, oh, it's so amazing because it talks about Ismene, as though Sophocles doesn't. And what I'm trying to say is for all these retellings, for all their power, they're actually not creating something from nothing. They're actually using dynamics already within, beneath, beyond, and within the ancient texts. So in a sense, the ancient texts are just as retelling and retellable as these adaptations. So thank you, and I hope this just gives a bit of a suggestion of the sorts of ways in which different texts, different relationships, and indeed different words can be probed in some of the literature that you might be looking at throughout the courses. Thank you. And we've got, I think, sort of 5 minutes or so, if I've got my timings right, for questions. So, yeah, if anyone has any questions, please do go ahead. Yeah, there's one halfway down. Thank you. Just to I'll repeat the question. So the question was about how these fictional relationships might have impacted real Greek and Roman women and their relationships with one another. And it's a very good question. I think, there's lots of kind of obviously unanswerable ways in terms of, if females were part of the audience of a Greek tragedy, and lots of people say, oh, we don't know and it doesn't matter. But of course, it would have affected things. I talk about a kind of dangerous intimacy. Of course, another question is dangerous for whom? The idea of what an audience would have thought. Well, every audience member, I have no doubt that you probably all have different ideas about whether you buy some of this and whether you want to ask different questions. So I think, of course, whether females would have had women would have had direct access to some of the fictional representations I would talk about would be one thing. And yet, I do think taking seriously the fact that women were mandated, expected, let alone allowed, to be involved in public funerals suggests that there was a sense in which both, as well as male anxieties, females themselves would be able to have a stake in their own participation. And it wouldn't be for me to say, or for any of us to say, how they would have felt about that. But if we put those two together, that these texts kind of enabling reflection on the fact of participation, which could both be empowering and also anxiety-inducing for the women as well. So yeah, I think it can go all kinds of ways. Thank you. Yeah, question there.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to ask, for what purposes do you think Sophocles is choosing to focus so much on women, and how do you think the male audience at the time would have received that and felt about it?
Yeah, thank you. And I think kind of related but different answer to my previous question. Firstly, one of the things I personally push back at slightly, which isn't your question, it's everywhere, including in my own work, so I do it myself, is it is impossible to say what an audience would have thought about anything. And part of it is just a shorthand that we all have, and we do it all the time, the reader, the lecture audience. But I think it is important to kind of sit with the fact that every audience member of every gender would have had a different relationship to what they are seeing, and different modes of attention. I think the important thing to bear in mind that this idea of it being either anxiety-inducing or liberating, not only are they false binaries, but it also depends on how involved people were, the status of their own family, the amount of attention they were paying. Whether people agree or disagree with what I say, and this is absolutely no disrespect, you've been a great audience. People don't pay attention to 100% of what's being said, let alone if you go second. And the fact that there is always going to be a zoom in and zoom out. So I think it's important to try to at least be aware, to nuance these kind of ideas of what, how would any audience member have taken all of this. With that being said, which is partly why I think the idea of kind of putting females and putting women on stage, also I'm using these interchangeably and I'm very much aware that they're not, but in the sense of from an ancient perspective without being anachronistic, having men dress up as female characters on stage, I think in a way that the reaction to that would very much depend on the audience member, on the play. So I think in a way, to answer your question specifically about sisters, which I think is kind of why I'm more interested in that, because it's not so much about it's not just about gender reflecting on gender or individual member of reflecting on individual member, or group reflecting on group. It's actually about sort of a unit of individuals. I guess that's what I'm getting at. So sisters are a way to kind of have two individuals operating as a kind of broken down microcosm within a much bigger group. So I think in a way, perhaps I'm more interested in what audiences could do with that type of relationship. And the fact that, as you say, it is a relationship between two women. So really, thinking through your question, using your question to think through what I actually think about this, rather than Medea or Antigone, one woman antithetical to so much of what is kind of the male polis and the Periclean ideal, two women who disagree with one another, who suffer injustices at the hands of other men and at the hands of one another, I think actually is the perfect space for a more nuanced reaction to the kind of scariness for a man or empowerment for a woman of having female characters on stage. We've got time for one more question. Oh, yeah. Beige jumper over there.
Thanks very much. Clearly, it's very difficult to say if, or it's difficult to say how, art influenced thinking at time, but to what extent, if any, can we sort of understand how the art has been influenced by attitudes at the time towards women, towards sisterly relationships? So my question is really, these playwrights, sort of Sophocles, for example, would you imagine that these portrayals come from sort of contemporary attitudes to some extent?
Thank you. Yes, interesting kind of three questions that work very well together. I think one of the things that is always interested, and I probably ought to have said at the beginning as well, that as well as this being which is something that you'll see a lot in the lectures that you hopefully go to in Oxford or Cambridge, is that because we're not trying to, it sounds like I'm not answering your question, I promise you I am, because we don't just do the who, what, when type of lectures. Often you'll get lectures based on your lecturer's own research on the text that we're teaching you, and this is something that I'm working on myself at the moment, is looking at the model of the sister in Greek literature, in Greek mythological poetics. And one of the things that I think interested me about this, which was kind of partly my answer to your question as well, is that sisters have always existed. This isn't sort of, I don't know, the shield of Aeneas, where we suddenly have Augustinism and this intrusion of the contemporary in a mythological world that shouldn't be therein. This isn't an intrusion of any kind of, in a sense, it's something that seems to surge into narrative in the 5th century, but it's always been there. So in a way, the extent to which it's intrinsically reflective of real relationships, because there have been sisters for as long as there have been families and women,